She stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, her hand pressed flat against the cold marble wall, and heard her husband's voice drift from the library with a calmness that sliced deeper than any shout. My marriage to Lady Alara was a duty, nothing more. The words hung in the still air like frost. She did not move. She could not. Her lungs refused to draw breath, and her heart seemed to pause as if waiting for the sentence to be undone. But the Duke of Ashford, Alexander Ashford, did not correct himself. He simply continued speaking to his friend Lord Whitmore, his tone measured, weary, entirely indifferent. "She is a suitable duchess," Alexander said, "capable, quiet. She does not ask for what I cannot give. Celeste will always be my wife in every way that matters. Alara knows that." Alara pressed her palm harder against the stone until the cold bit into her skin. She had known. Of course she had known. 6 months of marriage had taught her that Alexander's heart was entombed beside his first wife, the beautiful Celeste, who had died in a riding accident 3 years before. But hearing it spoken aloud, with such dispassionate finality, turned the hope she had secretly cradled into ash. She did not cry. Not there, not then. She simply turned, her silk slippers silent on the marble floor, and walked back toward the east wing where her own lonely chambers waited. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though she were wading through water. The candle-lit portraits of previous dukes and duchesses watched her pass, their painted eyes holding neither judgment nor comfort. She was nothing to them. She was nothing to him. When she reached her sitting room, she closed the door and leaned her forehead against the cool wood. Only then did one tear slip down her cheek. She caught it with the back of her hand and straightened her spine. She had been raised to endure disappointment with grace, and she would not crumble now. But something inside her shifted that night, something soft and hopeful that had stubbornly refused to die until that moment. It went quiet, and in its place grew a resolution so still and so certain that she barely recognized it as her own. She would stop waiting. Tomorrow she would begin to become someone who did not need Alexander Ashford's love. The first month of her quiet transformation passed almost unnoticed by the household. Alara rose each morning at the same hour, dressed impeccably, and took her breakfast alone in the morning room, the empty chair across from her a familiar ghost. She no longer lingered at the window hopping to glimpse Alexander riding out across the grounds. She no longer instructed the cook to prepare his favorite dishes in the desperate hope he might join her for dinner. She no longer searched for excuses to knock on his study door. Instead, she turned her attention outward. The Ashford estate was vast, and beyond the manicured gardens and gravel drives lay a village that had seen better decades. Alara had always possessed a compassionate heart, but grief and longing had narrowed her world to the cold walls of the manor. Now she pushed those walls away. She visited the parish poorhouse. She sat with elderly widows who had no one to remember their names. She listened to struggling tenant farmers who spoke of poor harvests and sick children and mounting debts. She did not merely nod sympathetically. She began to write letters, to petition the steward for small grants, to organize baskets of food and medicine from the manor's own stores. It was not charity performed for show. It was the work of a woman slowly reclaiming her purpose. The change did not go entirely unnoticed. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had served the first Duchess Celeste with devoted loyalty, watched the new Duchess with narrowed eyes. The staff had never been cruel to Alara, but they had never truly accepted her either. She existed in the shadow of a ghost, and that ghost was beloved. Celeste's portrait still hung in the great hall, her golden hair and laughing blue eyes forever frozen in youth and beauty. Alara, with her quiet brown eyes and dark hair and gentle voice, could not compete with a memory. She no longer tried. One afternoon, 6 weeks after that devastating overheard conversation, Alara returned from the village with mud on the hem of her walking dress and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She had spent 2 hours helping the baker's wife settle her fussing baby while the woman kneaded dough, and she felt a tired, honest contentment that surprised her. As she entered the front hall, she nearly collided with Alexander. He was dressed for riding, his dark coat immaculate, his expression unreadable. He stepped back to avoid touching her, and the automatic distance between them felt like a door closing. "You have been out," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Ilara replied, her voice calm. "I was in the village." He looked at her as though trying to solve a puzzle he had not known existed. Perhaps it was the dirt on her face, or the lack of the eager, hopeful light that used to shine in her eyes whenever she saw him. Something was different, and his brow furrowed. "I did not realize you had business there." "Neither did I," she said, "until I found it." She gave him a small, polite nod and continued toward the stairs, leaving him standing alone in the marble entryway. He did not call her back, but for the first time in their marriage, she did not look over her shoulder to see if he was watching. He was. The weeks that followed unspooled with a strange, suspended quiet. Autumn bled into early winter, and the estate settled into the slower rhythms of the cold season. Alexander began to notice things he had previously ignored. The music room, where Ilara used to play the pianoforte every evening in the hope that he might pause outside the door, had fallen silent. The chair across from his study hearth, where she had sometimes sat with her embroidery just to be near him, remained empty. He had not realized how accustomed he had grown to her quiet presence until it vanished. He told himself it was relief. She had finally understood the terms of their arrangement. He had married her out of necessity, to secure a political alliance with her uncle the Earl of Harwood, and to quiet the rumors that his grief had made him unstable. Ilara's family had needed the match as well. Her father's reputation had been tarnished by financial scandal, and marriage to a duke restored a measure of respectability. It was a transaction. She had seemed to accept that. But the woman who now moved through his house with serene composure and distant eyes did not behave like a woman defeated. She behaved like someone who had simply chosen to live elsewhere, even while standing in the same room. And that unsettled him far more than her tears ever had. The first real crack in his indifference came on a frostbitten evening in late November. Alexander had returned from a tedious session of business in London and found the manor uncharacteristically quiet. He inquired after the Duchess and was told she was hosting a small gathering in the west parlor. Curious, he walked that way, expecting to find a handful of local gentry sipping tea. Instead, he found a room full of women from the village. Farmers' wives, the seamstress, the apothecary's daughter, the elderly widow who kept the bookshop. They were all listening intently as Ilara, seated in their midst, read aloud from a letter. Her voice was warm and animated in a way he had never heard. "So you see," she was saying, "the London charity has agreed to match whatever funds we raise for the new schoolroom. We need only gather half the sum ourselves." A murmur of excitement rippled through the women. One of them, a plump, ruddy-cheeked farmer's wife named Mrs. Tully, reached over and squeezed Ilara's hand. "You've done more for this village in 2 months than the parish council has managed in 2 years, Your Grace. Truly." Ilara smiled, and Alexander felt the expression strike him like a physical blow. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was completely, utterly unfamiliar. He had never seen her smile like that. He had never made her smile like that. He stepped back from the doorway before anyone noticed him, his chest tight with an emotion he refused to name. The following Sunday brought the first public test of her new resilience. The Ashfords attended church in the village, a weekly ritual that Ilara had once dreaded because it meant sitting beside a husband who looked through her as though she were made of glass. Now she simply folded her hands in her lap, listened to the sermon, and afterward lingered outside to speak with the villagers who had become her friends. It was there that Lady Honoria Pemberton, the housekeeper's niece and a young woman whose chief talent was the art of unkind observation, approached with a honeyed smile. "Your Grace," Honoria said, her voice carrying just far enough for others to hear, "I do hope you are not overtiring yourself with all this village work. It must be such a comfort to have a purpose, especially when one's husband is so often occupied with memories of the past. The words were a needle wrapped in silk. Alara felt the sting, but she did not flinch. She met Honoria's gaze with a calm that surprised even herself. "Purpose is a gift I am grateful for," she replied. "I recommend it to anyone with too much time on their hands and too little kindness in their hearts." Honoria's smile froze. A few nearby villagers hid grins behind their gloved hands. Alara turned away and walked toward the carriage, her heartbeat steady, her head high. Alexander, standing some distance away in conversation with the vicar, had heard every word. He watched his wife walk past him without a glance, and something hot and unpleasant coiled in his stomach. Not guilt, not yet, but the uncomfortable awareness that he had underestimated the woman he had married. Winter deepened, and with it came the annual Ashford Christmas Ball, an event that had been a tradition for generations. Alara had once imagined herself at Alexander's side for such an occasion, radiant in a gown of deep velvet, her hand resting on his arm. That fantasy had withered long ago. When the evening arrived, she dressed with the help of her maid and looked at herself in the mirror with a kind of quiet acceptance. She was not Celeste. She would never be Celeste. But she was the Duchess of Ashford, and she had a duty to perform. The great hall blazed with candlelight and the sound of string music. Guests filled the room in a swirl of silk and jewels. Alara descended the staircase alone, her gown the color of winter moss, simple and elegant. She felt the weight of eyes upon her, some curious, some pitying, some openly dismissive. She did not falter. Alexander was already in the hall, speaking with Lord and Lady Danforth. When he glanced up and saw Alara, something flickered across his face. She did not see it. She was already being approached by Lord Edmund Blackwood, a handsome young baron with an easy smile and a wicked sense of humor. Edmund had known Alara since childhood, and he had never hidden his admiration for her. "Alara," he said, bowing over her hand with playful formality, "you look like a frost fairy, cold and entirely too beautiful for this company." She laughed, a genuine sound that carried across the room. "You are ridiculous, Edmund." "Ridiculous and devoted. Dance with me. We shall scandalize the matrons." She allowed herself to be led onto the dance floor. Edmund's hand was warm at her waist, his steps light, his conversation a stream of gossip and nonsense that coaxed smile after smile from her. For a few minutes, she forgot the cold weight of the house she lived in. She forgot the empty chair at the dinner table. She forgot her husband. Alexander did not forget. He watched from the edge of the room, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, his jaw tight. He had never seen Alara laugh like that. He had never seen her eyes sparkle with that particular light. And he had certainly never seen another man's hand rest so comfortably, so confidently on the small of her back. Lord Whitmore appeared at his elbow. "Your Duchess seems in high spirits tonight." "She is enjoying the company of old friends," Alexander said, his voice carefully level. "Old friends," Whitmore repeated, a knowing lilt in his tone. "Blackwood has been back from the continent less than a month and has already called at Ashford 3 times. Curious." Alexander said nothing, but he did not look away from the dance floor for the rest of the waltz. The ball marked a turning point, though neither of them spoke of it. Alara continued her village work, her quiet confidence growing with each passing week. She no longer arranged her days around Alexander's schedule. She no longer waited up to hear his footsteps in the corridor. She filled her time with purpose, and in doing so, she slowly starved the ache that had once consumed her. And Alexander, the Duke of Ashford, who had believed himself incapable of feeling anything beyond numb grief, began to experience a sensation he had not anticipated: loneliness. He would walk past the music room and remember the sound of her playing. He would see a book left open on a window seat and realize she had been there, but he had not known. He would notice the way the staff brightened when she returned from the village, their affection for her no longer hidden. She was weaving herself into the fabric of the estate, and he was the one thread that remained stubbornly, achingly disconnected. One evening in January, he found himself standing outside her sitting room door. He had no clear reason to be there. He simply wanted to see her. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see her seated by the fire, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, a letter in her hand. She was reading it with a soft, tender expression that made his chest constrict. Then she pressed the letter to her heart and closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. Alexander's breath caught. He wanted to go to her to ask who had written that letter, to demand why she wept. But he had no right. He had built the wall between them stone by stone, and now he stood on the wrong side of it, staring through a crack. He turned and walked away, his steps heavy, the ghost of Celeste suddenly feeling less like a comfort and more like a chain he had willingly locked around his own heart. The letter, had he known it, was from her younger sister Lydia, who had written with the news that their father's health was failing. The old baron had never recovered from the disgrace of his financial ruin, and the shame had eaten away at him. Ilara wept not only for her father, but for the tangled web of sacrifice and silence that had led her to this house, this marriage, this strange half-life. She did not know the whole truth of how her marriage had been arranged. She only knew that her uncle had brokered it and that Alexander had accepted. She assumed it was duty, obligation, perhaps pity. She did not know that Alexander had refused 3 wealthier brides before agreeing to take her. She did not know that he had paid her father's debts in full, anonymously, before the wedding contract was even signed. She did not know that he had once watched her from across a ballroom, 3 years before Celeste's death, and thought to himself that she was the most quietly enchanting woman he had ever seen. She did not know that his coldness was not indifference, but fear. Fear of losing someone again. Fear of loving and being shattered. Fear that he was not worthy of the light she carried. But she would learn, and so would he. The revelation came on a gray afternoon in February, when rain lashed the windows and the manor lay wrapped in damp gloom. Ilara had gone to the library searching for a book on agricultural methods, something to help the tenant farmers with a stubborn blight affecting their crops. As she scanned the shelves, her fingers brushed a leather-bound volume that was slightly out of place. When she pulled it free, a letter slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up. The handwriting was Alexander's, bold and dark, but the ink was faded as though it had been written long ago. The date at the top made her heart stumble. It was dated 2 months before their wedding. She should not have read it, but she could not stop herself. Ilara, I do not know if I will ever have the courage to give you this letter. You know me only as a distant acquaintance, a duke with a cold reputation and a dead wife. You do not know that I have watched you for years, that I saw you at the Hadfield ball and could not look away, that I asked your uncle for an introduction and was told you were already promised to another, that I waited and I hoped, and when I heard that your engagement had ended, I felt such shameful, terrible joy. You do not know that, when your father's ruin threatened to destroy your family, I went to your uncle and offered for your hand not out of duty, but because I could not bear the thought of you suffering. I could not bear the thought of you marrying a man who would not treasure you. But I am not a man who knows how to treasure anyone. Celeste's death was my fault. I was away when her horse threw her. I was away when she took her last breath. I promised myself I would never love again because love makes you vulnerable and vulnerability destroys you. And yet here I am, writing to a woman I have no right to love, hoping that perhaps one day I will find the courage to tell her that she is not a duty. She never was. Forgive me for being a coward. Forgive me for the coldness you will surely face. I do not know how to be anything else. Yours in silence, Alexander. Ilara's hands trembled. The letter blurred before her eyes. She read it again, and then a third time, her mind struggling to reconcile the words on the page with the man who had looked through her for 6 months. He had loved her. He had chosen her. Not out of pity or obligation, but out of a hidden, desperate affection that he had buried so deeply even she could not find it. And he had buried it because he was afraid. She pressed the letter to her chest and wept, not with sorrow this time, but with a tangled, overwhelming rush of grief and hope and anger. He had let her believe she was unwanted. He had let her suffer in silence. He had let her slowly wither, and all the while, this letter lay hidden in a book, gathering dust. She could not confront him immediately. She needed time to think, to process, to decide what to do with this knowledge. She tucked the letter into her pocket and left the library, her mind spinning. That evening she sat alone at dinner, as she had done for so many nights. But when Alexander unexpectedly appeared in the doorway, his expression strangely hesitant, she looked up at him with eyes that were no longer guarded. They were wounded, but they were also open. "May I join you?" he asked. She nodded. He sat across from her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken things. "I saw you with Lord Blackwood again today," he finally said, his tone carefully neutral. "He visits frequently." "Edmund is a friend," Alara replied. "He has been kind to me when few others have." The words landed with quiet precision. Alexander's jaw tightened. He looked down at his plate, then back at her. "I have not been kind," he said. "It was not a question." "No," she agreed, "you have not." The honesty of her reply seemed to strip the air from his lungs. He had expected politeness, evasion, perhaps even timid reassurance. Not this calm, unflinching truth. "Alara," he began, but she shook her head. "Not tonight," she said. "I am not ready to hear explanations tonight. I only want to eat my dinner in peace. Can you give me that?" He could, and he did, but the meal was the longest of his life. The days that followed were strange and fragile. Alara did not reveal that she had found the letter, but she began to watch Alexander with new eyes. She saw the way his gaze followed her now, the way he hovered at the edges of her life as if waiting for permission to step closer. She saw the tension in his shoulders when Edmund Blackwood called with a bouquet of hothouse flowers. She saw the shadow of regret that darkened his features when she laughed at Edmund's jokes, but offered Alexander only polite smiles. And Alexander, for his part, felt the ground shifting beneath him. He did not know what had changed, but something had. Alara was no longer the quiet, yearning woman he had married. She was still kind, still graceful, but there was a new armor around her heart, and he did not know how to penetrate it. He began to realize with dawning horror that he might be too late, that she might have already given up on him. The thought terrified him more than any grief ever had. The crisis came on a night of howling wind and driving sleet. A messenger arrived at the manor, soaked and shivering, with news that the orphanage in the village had caught fire. The old building's thatch roof had ignited from a fallen chimney spark, and the children and the matron were trapped inside. Alara did not hesitate. She grabbed her heaviest cloak and ran for the stables, shouting for a horse. Alexander caught up with her in the courtyard, his face pale in the flickering torchlight. "You cannot go," he said, grabbing her arm. "It is too dangerous." "There are children in that building," she shot back, her voice fierce. "I will not stand here while they burn." She wrenched free of his grip and swung onto the horse. For a heartbeat, he stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Then he mounted his own horse, and together they rode through the storm. The orphanage was a nightmare of smoke and flame. Villagers had formed a bucket line, but the fire was too fierce. The matron stood outside, sobbing, clutching two small children. "There are still 3 inside," she screamed. "The little ones in the back room." Alara did not think. She wrapped her wet cloak around her head and plunged into the burning doorway. Alexander shouted her name, but she was already gone, swallowed by the smoke. He followed her. The heat was monstrous. Alara crouched low, her eyes stinging, her lungs burning. She found the back room by memory, having visited the orphanage many times. 3 small figures huddled under a bed, coughing and crying. She gathered them as best she could, shielding them with her body, and stumbled back toward the door. A beam crashed down behind her, blocking the corridor. She heard Alexander's voice, raw and desperate, somewhere ahead. "Alara, where are you?" Here, she choked out, I have the children. He appeared through the smoke, his coat singed, his face streaked with soot. He took two of the children from her arms, and together they staggered out into the freezing night air just as the roof collapsed. The villagers surged forward. The children were pulled into waiting arms, coughing but alive. Ilara dropped to her knees in the mud, gasping, her body shaking. Alexander knelt beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his eyes wild with a fear she had never seen. "Don't ever do that again," he rasped. "Do you hear me? Do not ever do that again. I cannot lose you." She looked up at him, her face smeared with ash, her eyes wide. "You would not have lost me, Alexander. I am not yours to lose." The words were not cruel. They were simply true, and they broke something inside him. He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a desperation that shocked them both. His body trembled. His breath was ragged against her hair. "You are," he said, his voice cracking. "You are mine. You have always been mine. I was just too blind, too afraid, too much a coward to tell you." She did not push him away. She let him hold her there in the mud and the sleet and the dying glow of the fire, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt the wall between them crumble. Later, in the quiet of the manor, after baths and warm blankets and the reassurance that the children were safe, they sat together in his study. The fire crackled. The storm had eased. Ilara wore a woolen dressing gown, her hair still damp, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Alexander sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. "I found your letter," she said softly. He lifted his head. "What letter?" She reached into the pocket of her gown and drew out the worn paper. She held it out to him. He stared at it, and all the color drained from his face. "I did not know you had kept it," he whispered. "It was in a book. I found it by accident." She paused. "You should have given it to me. You should have told me the truth." "I did not know how." His voice was hoarse. "I had spent so long locked inside my own guilt and fear that I had forgotten how to let anyone in. When Celeste died, I swore I would never love again. I thought that if I kept you at a distance, I could protect myself, and protect you from the broken man I had become." "But you did love me," she said, "even then." "Yes." He met her eyes, and there was no coldness now, only raw, aching honesty. "I loved you before I even had the right to. I loved you when I saw you across that ballroom, and I loved you when I heard you had lost your first engagement, and I loved you when your uncle came to me with the proposal. I told myself I was marrying you for duty, for politics, but it was a lie. I married you because I could not bear the thought of anyone else having you." Ilara set her teacup aside. Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "You let me believe I was nothing to you. You let me believe I was a burden. Do you know what that did to me?" "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if you will let me. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to ask for your love, but I am asking anyway because I am tired of being a coward. I am tired of living in a tomb of my own making. I want to live. I want to live with you." She was silent for a long moment. The fire popped and shifted. Outside, the wind whispered against the glass. Then she stood, crossed the space between them, and knelt before his chair. She took his hands in hers, her touch gentle but firm. "I stopped waiting for you," she said. "I stopped hopping. I learned to be whole without you. And that is the only reason I can be here now, offering you a chance. Not because I am desperate, not because I have no other choice, but because I see you, Alexander. I see the man who wrote that letter. The man who risked his life tonight to save children he barely knows. The man who has been hiding for so long he forgot how to be seen." A tear slipped down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. "Can you ever love me after everything?" She smiled, and it was the smile he had first seen in that ballroom years ago, the one that had stolen his breath and never given it back. "I have loved you," she said, "since the day you stood in my uncle's drawing room and looked at me as though I were not a problem to be solved, but a person. I loved you through the silence and the distance and the cold. I loved you even when I thought I would never be loved in return. I do not know if I ever stopped. I only know that I am tired of pretending I do not feel it." He pulled her up into his arms and she went willingly, her head tucking beneath his chin, her heart beating against his. They held each other as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them. It was not a passionate embrace, not a dramatic declaration. It was something simpler and deeper. It was two people, broken and healing, choosing to face the future together. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. There were still awkward silences and old wounds that flared unexpectedly. There were nights when Alexander woke from nightmares of fire and loss, and mornings when Alara retreated into the quiet armor she had built. But there were also long walks through the frozen gardens, hands clasped inside a single muff. There were dinners where they talked for hours about everything and nothing. There were moments when he caught her eye across a crowded room and smiled, and she smiled back, and the world felt impossibly, achingly right. Spring came to Ashford with a riot of green and blossom. The village celebrated the reopening of the orphanage, rebuilt with funds raised by the Duchess and a generous donation from the Duke. The children called her Lady Alara, and she carried them on her hip as if she had done so her whole life. On a warm afternoon in May, Alexander found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, planting roses with the gardener's daughter. Her hands were muddy, her hair was escaping its pins, and she was laughing. He stood at the edge of the path and watched her, and his heart swelled with a gratitude so fierce it stole his voice. She looked up and saw him. Her smile softened into something private and precious. "Are you going to stand there staring?" she called. "Or are you going to help me dig?" He walked over, knelt beside her, and took the trowel from her hand. Their fingers brushed, and the contact felt like a promise. "I will help you," he said, "with anything, everything, for the rest of my life." She leaned over and pressed a kiss to his cheek, leaving a smudge of dirt on his skin. "Then dig, your grace," she whispered. "We have a garden to grow." And so they did. Together they planted roses that would bloom for years to come, their roots sinking deep into the earth, their petals opening to the sun. And in the quiet, ordinary magic of that afternoon, two hearts that had once been strangers finally, truly came home.